Well, welcome back. Now, as we've been reporting throughout the morning, President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced various interventions to curb the spread of the coronavirus in the country. And they include the closure of South Africa's borders to all foreign nationals from countries that have been highly impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, including the United States and Britain. Now, in declaring the COVID-19 crisis a national disaster, the president also announced the closure of schools from Wednesday and banned public gatherings of more than 100 people. For some more reaction to this, we are joined on the line now by health and hygiene tips for South Africans by Professor Mosa Moshabela, who is the Dean and Head of School for Nursing and Public Health at UKZN. Thanks so much for your time this morning, Professor.
Thank you.
Now, firstly, Professor, your reaction to the interventions as announced by the President last night?
Very, very exciting. It came as a relief to us. And I think that even though people are saying that it could have been done earlier, we are so grateful that it has happened. For us, I think that it signifies the significance of the issue at hand and the problem at hand and the challenge at hand. And it also agrees with what we initially kind of conceptualized as a war room, to say that we are in wartime, even though the threat is invisible, but it is definitely a common threat, and it requires collective sector-wide approach to be able to stop it. So I'm very excited.
But some have already criticized these measures, saying that the interventions are not being considerate of poor South Africans when it speaks to issues such as self-isolation and quarantining for people who live in, say, for example, informal settlements. Your thoughts on that?
It's absolutely true. And I think that it is something that we have to take seriously. We've had a number of people call us and ask, how do we actually make quarantine work? Not just people who are sort of on the lower end of the economic spectrum, but even people who are middle class. They're saying that, look, our daughter has just returned from a trip overseas. Now she has to stay in the outbuilding, in the backyard or in the cottage. And that is very difficult psychologically and emotionally. It's almost like you're treating them as if they're contaminated. There's a whole lot of social and psychological factors that affect the interventions that have been put in place. And the president has said that, it is necessarily disruptive. And I think that if we can understand that it is a national disaster, then we can also understand that it is necessary to put in place measures to mitigate any unintended consequences, including mobilizing resources and support for people who are going to be greatly affected by this. People who earn daily wages or weekly wages are going to be extremely affected by this. But I must say that it is better to do it now than to do it later. If we waited for later, the situation was going to be worse, and those people were going to be even worse, more affected. I think people have to understand that sometimes it's difficult for us to appreciate interventions when they are put in place in anticipation of a worst case scenario. Sometimes it's easier to see a worst case scenario before we can believe it, but we don't want to go there. I think this is important for people to understand.
Professor Moshabela, another issue, of course, largely raises that of people who have to use public transport like taxis or trains, for example. Yeah. What sort of advice do you have in terms of how they can go about safeguarding themselves against the spread of the virus?
Yeah, this is another difficult one. I think that, again, everybody needs to understand what a national disaster means. And I think also we need to treat this situation accordingly as a national disaster. The president has given us a room to basically put in place measures, but not specific measures of how to run operations. So everybody has to figure out a solution. My view is that a lot of the sort of public transportation can still be managed if people understood their part in mitigating the spread of the virus. And this includes many of the hygiene messages and practices that we've been talking about. And it requires a very selfless approach for one person to protect the next person. That means even when a person is sick, not go into a vehicle. like a taxi or a bus or something like that. I think that it's important for people to understand that everybody has to play their part, and the measures that are put in place only create the platform on which we can then be able to implement these hygiene practices to prevent spread.
Professor, that would speak to employers as well, because someone who is sick and getting onto a taxi wouldn't do so unless they felt an immediate threat of a job loss, for example.
Absolutely. And someone has correctly mentioned to me earlier on to say that, even our labor market and employer kind of system does not allow or create space for someone with a flu or a cold to stay home. If it's not necessarily going to put you in bed and leave you bedridden, it's not enough for you not to come to work. And that has to change. And this is why the call for behavior change and change of practices is so important. And we have to take it seriously. It's not only significant for now in terms of the national disaster, but also going forward into the future. So I agree absolutely that employers have to understand that it's important to break transmission of infections that, of course, we cannot see with our naked eyes, but we know they are there. And if we are not careful, they can spread like wildfire. We just need to make sure that we cooperate with the president's orders.
There is, of course, other very sombering realities of people who do not have access to or acceptable sanitary toilet facilities. There are people who don't have safe water to drink, never mind wash their hands. What sort of advice do you have for these people, Professor Moshabela?
Yeah, I think one part is the responsibility of the state, because at the current moment, South Africa should not be in a situation where we have those kinds of people. I think that one way to look at it is an opportunity to be able to make sure that the problems that those people have can be resolved with more medium and long-term definitive measures. That's one part of it, the responsibility of the state. But I think in the short term, for the people who are in those conditions, there's two things that are important. I think that one is that generally rural people are quite creative. They are able to boil water, to use fire basically to solve a lot of the problems that they have. They can boil water in terms of making sure that they've got clean water. They are also able to use water and other hygiene measures that have been used before in sanitation. In order to make sure that they can sterilize water. There are all these interventions from sanitation that we can use. But my concern with this group of people is how infections are going to be transported from cities into these informal settlements and also into rural villages. I think that we also have to understand what restricting movements actually mean. At this point, if we restricted movement from cities into villages, we could prevent a lot of spread of COVID-19 virus going into villages. But I think that some people are understanding this to mean that, oh yeah, we can now go on holiday and go back to our homes. We've seen it with HIV when infections were taken from cities to villages. We want to avoid that. I think for the duration of the national disaster, it will be really good because many of these infections may still be restricted to cities. It will be really good to restrict movement within cities. And that's also where the capacity to intervene actively against COVID-19 remains, rather than allow movement to take and migration to take the infection out into remote areas.
There are just so many challenges, Professor Moshabela. As you said, good hygiene practices, but for some people, for some households, just the cost of extra soap could be a challenge in and of itself. We talk about social distancing, and as our previous guest, David van Wyk, points out, it's not even a matter of social distancing. Physical distancing is, in some instances, not even an option. So what's the way forward?
Yeah, I think that I wish there was a convenient and comfortable way to prevent the spread of COVID-19, but there isn't. And I can tell you that it's easy for us to complain when we have not seen the worst that can happen. But again, we just have to trust leadership and people who can envision and visualize the worst case scenario. We don't want to see it. And we have to allow the inconvenience and the disruption that is happening currently for us to prevent a worst case scenario. Because there is just no way our health system is going to cope. And, my view is that social distancing is not an option if we really want to succeed. We have to implement it. Uncomfortable and disruptive as it is something that we have to just practice and trust that it is going to help us survive the storm that is pending. I also think that, yes, I understand that, psychologically and emotionally, contact is important for people to be healthy. We are countries that rely a lot on contact and social contact. But, if you look at countries that are similar to us in that way, like Spain and Italy, people who engage a lot, they have a lot of social bonding. They are hard hit by the virus. Whereas countries like Japan that naturally has social distance, they are coping a lot better. And we really don't want to see a scenario where we are having to deal with the worst case scenario of COVID-19. We've seen what it can do in other places. It hasn't happened here. We don't want to see it happen. And I also think that it will be good for everyone to understand that the decisions that were taken by the president were not taken easily. It was very hard for the president to actually announce those measures. And it will be very hard for us to carry them out. But also, I think that there is an obligation, given the act, for us and the government wields a lot of power to enforce those measures. Let's just lead as citizens and make sure that we put them in place so that we can have a fighting chance.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Mosa Moshabela, who is the Dean and Head of School for Nursing and Public Health, talking to us about precautionary measures that can be used as a means of reducing the risk of being infected by COVID-19. He is, of course, with UKZN. And that brings us up to sports time. Valen, standing by.